Turn with me this morning to Philippians 4. Philippians 4, 7. Philippians 4, 7. It says this in Philippians 4, 7, if I can, there it is. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your heart and your minds in Christ Jesus. Actually, let's go all the way back up to 4. The peace of God. We're talking about the peace of God a little bit this morning. The title of the sermon is called, It Is Well With My Soul. All the way up to 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Let your gentle spirit be known to all men, and the Lord is near. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your mind in Christ Jesus. I want peace. I want peace. I want peace in my home. I want peace in my heart. I want peace in our community. And I want that peace that guards my heart and mind. That's what I want. I want peace that guards my heart and mind. So what is peace? And what does peace look like? I pulled this out of a website I like to go to because that word peace in the Hebrew is shalom. Shalom. And it's a website that's called My Jewish Learning. It is not a Christian website. It is actually a Jewish website, but I get a lot of cultural context through that and understanding. And so one of the Hebrew phrase, the Hebrew word for peace is shalom, is derived from the root denoting wholeness or completeness. It's a frame of reference throughout all Jewish literature and is bound up with the notion of perfection. So when we're talking about, we're not talking about just like two people that are in conflict being at peace with one another. We're talking about just wholeness. That we talked a little bit about that in Sunday school this morning. How when you're coming from a trip and you're coming in, and for me it's when I drop in from Montana or coming from Washington, when I just cross the border into Idaho, right? It just feels like for me coming down Lookout Pass and I coming back home from Montana, it's just like all the weight's lifted. It's like everything that is familiar to me starts bringing that rest and bringing that peace. There's like this completion, and it's the opposite when I head, would be west. When I start going into Seattle and I drop from Snoqualmie into Seattle, it's the opposite. I start feeling tension and I start feeling heaviness and feel like the lanes are getting wider, but everything's closing in around me. But I feel peace when I come back home. It's just that rest. It's not limited to the political domain. It's not about war or enmity or strife. It ranges over all spheres. It can reference to different contexts. The physical condition, it talks about moral value. The theologian Dr. John Stackhouse says this: shalom is peace. It's flourishing. It's each individual element flourishing, and each relationship flourishing. And everything lives up to what it can be, and everything is whole. Everything lives up to what it can be. Man, it just feels good. See, that's what that whole idea of shalom is like. When Jesus returns and he restores all humanity and all creation, there's a new heaven and a new earth. Everything's as it should be. Everything is right in the world. Relationships are there's that peace there. There's hope. It just feels good. See, I want that peace that surpasses all understanding, all comprehension. I want that peace to guard my heart and mind in Christ Jesus. But we live in a time that is a little bit of a struggle right now. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't feel like peace right now in our time. There's a lot of tension. There's just a lot of tension. Wherever we go, whatever we do, even going in to the Benoit market, if you have to wear a mask and you don't want to, there's tension. There's frustration. It doesn't seem like there's peace. You turn on the news, there's not peace. There's warring factions right now within our country. And it's hard. How can it be well with my soul? How can I be at peace? How can I be at rest in times like this? It's crazy. If I don't like you, right now in different places, if you don't like somebody, the best thing you can do is punch them. Right? That's what's happening right now. I don't like something that's happening, then I'm just going to go steal from other people because that's what's good. It doesn't make any sense, and we're just at this tension, and one side of people look at it this way and they're all frustrated, and the other side looks at the other side and goes, we're all frustrated, and there's just tension. I want peace. How can we get to that place where it is well with my soul? It is well with my soul. You guys hear that song before?
Yep.
It is well with my soul. I'm going to read you a story of how that song came about. It's an old hymn. And like most old hymns and most songs completely, they have a story behind them. How did that come about? It is well with my soul. And I'm going to probably hack up these names. And so if you know this story really well and I say this person's name wrong, don't be offended. Be at peace. Horatio G. Spafford was a successful lawyer and businessman in Chicago with a lovely family, a wife, Anna, and 5 children. However, they were not strangers to tears and tragedy. The young son died with pneumonia in 1871. In that same year, much of their business was lost in the Great Chicago Fire. Yet God in His mercies and kindness allowed the business to flourish once more. On November 21st, 1873, the French ocean liner Ville du Havre was crossing the Atlantic from the U.S. to Europe with 313 passengers on board. Among these passengers was Mrs. Spafford and their 4 daughters. Although Mr. Spafford had planned to go with his family, he found it necessary to stay in Chicago to help solve an unexpected business problem. He told his wife he would join her and their children in Europe a few days later. His plan was to take another ship. About 4 days into the crossing of the Atlantic, the Ville de Havre, with the ship, collided with the powerful iron-hulled Scottish ship, the Loch Earn. And suddenly all of those aboard were in grave danger. Anna hurriedly brought her 4 children to the deck and knelt there with Annie, Margaret, Lee, and Bessie, and Tanit, this other young lady, and prayed that God would spare them if it could be His will, or to take them willing, or to make them willing to endure whatever awaited them. Within approximately 12 minutes, the ship slipped beneath the dark waters of the Atlantic, carrying with it 226 passengers, including the 4 Stafford children. A sailor rowing a small boat over the spot where the ship went down spotted a woman floating on a piece of wreckage. It was Anna, still alive. He pulled her out of the boat, and there he picked up a large vessel, they were picked up by another large vessel 9 days later, landed them in Wales. From there, she wired her husband a message which began, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" Mr. Spafford later framed the telegram and placed it in his office. Another ship survivor, Pastor Weiss, later recalled Anna saying, "God gave me 4 daughters, and now he's taken them from me. Someday, I will understand why." Mr. Spafford booked passage to the next available ship and left to join his grieving wife. With the ship about 4 days out, the captain called the Spafford to his cabin and told him they were over the place where his children went down. According to Bertha Spafford Vester, a daughter born after the tragedy, Spafford wrote, "It is well with my soul while on this journey, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul." Anna gave birth to 3 more children, one of which died at the age of 4 with dreaded pneumonia. In August of 1881, the Spaffords moved to Jerusalem, and Mr. Spafford died and was buried in that city. How do you go at such a dark moment in your life and to be able to write a song that says, "It is well with my soul"? How do you go to such great loss and trust in the Lord through it all? It was a difficult time in his life, and somehow he penned, "It is well with my soul." We are at a point of choosing leadership in our country. As I thought about this Sunday in particular, and with the unrest in our country, what to preach. Do I just start a new sermon series? And I didn't quite feel like we're there yet. Next week we'll start a new sermon series called Why Church? Why do we need church? Why should we be in church? But why church? But this week we want to talk a little bit about choosing leadership, because leadership really is direction. Leadership is direction. The leader directs the heart of a nation. The leader directs the heart of a nation. See, there's so much concern out there, and rightfully so. See, as we come into this week, as we saw from this last week, if you've been watching any news, it's probably going to get really crazy. No matter what happens and what the outcome is, come Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, probably weeks afterwards. No matter what happens, it's going to get crazy. It is. There is going to be warring factions. People crying foul. Neighbor against neighbor. Family member against family member. We are on the precipice in our country of very contentious and tenuous times. But how should we respond? What should our response be as believers in God? What should our response be no matter what happens this week? How do we be at peace? Because that's very important. It's very important that we are at peace. How should the people of God respond? Whatever our lot this week, what shall we say? Whatever my lot this week, what shall we say? I want to be honest, leading up to these last few weeks has been a lot of tension in my mind. I mean, my mind has just been running. I don't think we've seen much like this in our country for a very long time, if ever. The tensions, the fighting, the both sides just trying to tear each other down. It's just crazy. But I wanted to start this way, is how I want to start with a time we see a choosing of leadership in the Bible. So in that time, in those days, they called the leader the king, right? And we're not going to go through all of 1 Samuel 8 through chapter 16 because that's a lot of chapters. But after the time of the prophet, Samuel was the prophet, and there were judges. And so when people had issues, they would go to the judge. We see the book of Judges, or God would raise up a judge to lead the people for a certain time, a certain purpose. In the time of the judges, and really the last one we see is Samuel, and he is a prophet. And something happens. The people come to Samuel and say, hey, you're getting old. You're getting old. And it's time for you to your sons don't follow in your ways. So it's time, we want a king. Give us a king. And so Samuel went to the Lord. The Lord says, fine, give them a king, and I will choose for you. And then God chose the king. God chose the leader. The question is how would God do that? How would God choose a leader to lead the nation? Because what God looks at and what man looks at are two different things. See, when the people came and said, we need a king to lead us, to be over us, because we want to be like everybody else, right? What essentially they were doing was rejecting God as their king. And they said, we want a king over us like everybody else has. And God says, fine, I'll let you have your way. And so God chose for them a king. And what would God look at? And these men that were asking for this were looking for a valiant man, a strong man, tall. Right? You want in those days, a king was strong. You didn't want a wimp. Right? You wanted, when people saw your king, to cower. It's like, woo, king, right? And so that's what God chose for them. He chose him Saul. He was a towering, handsome man. And if we read through that story, as God selected him, he actually was with the prophets and began to prophesy as like one of the prophets. And people looked at him and says, is this Saul? He is prophesying like one of the prophets. And God had moved on his life. And people began to see that this was the guy that was anointed king because Samuel had anointed him. And they began to follow, but some questioned, I don't know if we want to follow this guy. And they went and had this great battle and had this great victory. And then people's like, yeah, all right, that's our king. Yeah, he can fight. He's beautiful or handsome. Look at him. He's strong. But the problem was even though he's good looking and God gave the people what they wanted, gave them what they thought they needed, even though he had a heart to serve at first, he fell short with his follow-through. He decided that he wanted to serve God his way and do some of the things the way he wanted to rather than follow God. And ultimately, his relationship with God came through the prophet. Because the prophet, and it was his relationship with God. When he wanted something from God or needed to ask God, he would go to the prophet, and the prophet would ask God, and then we would lay those things. And he wouldn't necessarily follow them, and that's why he got in trouble. And the kingdom got stripped from him because he would not follow what God had commanded. Saul was an imperfect person, but the problem was not his imperfection, it was his relationship with God. Because his relationship with God was through the prophet. That would be like saying that, you know what, the only time you really go to God today is when you go to church. And the only time you pray is you ask the pastor to pray for you. And then he asked the pastor, how to do this and how to do that. So pastor, would you go to God for me and then talk to God and ask him if I should do this business transaction? And then when God tells you, you tell me, and then I will do it. We think that's a little weird, right? That you had to come to me with all your choices with God. Right? That's odd. But that's the kind of relationship Saul had with God. He would go to Samuel to get that relationship going. Which was fine as a king to go to the prophet to seek the Lord for things. That was fine. But he did not have a real heart for God. His relationship went through the prophet. And he did things his own way, and the kingdom was stripped. See, God chose him. It wasn't a mistake. God chose him for that purpose, for that plan, to show the Israelites that if you get what you want, it's not necessarily a good thing. Because I look at something different. See, God does not look at the outward appearance of a man or a woman. He looks at their heart. He is looking for men and women after his own heart. That is what he is looking for. And so, in doing so, he chose David. 1 Samuel 13:14 says this. This is how he announced that Saul's kingdom was going to come to an end. He said, "But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." See, what God is really looking for in a leader is somebody that chooses God's ways, to follow the commands of God. He looks at the heart of a person. See, David did not look the part. He was a handsome young man, don't get me wrong. He was a handsome young man, but he was the run of the litter. When he was chosen as king, anointed as king, Jesse paraded all of his sons before Samuel, because God led him to Jesse's house and paraded all of his sons. And he's like, "Hey, is this all you have? Because God says they're not it." "Well, I have my youngest. He's out in the field with the sheep." "Bring him in." Brings him in, and he says, "This is it. Your runt." And God chose him to be king. And there was a whole process. He didn't that day go, "I'm king," and just get... It wasn't like that. Years later, after the promise, years later, it took for him to be established king. See, he was last in the family, but first in the kingdom. He wasn't supposed to be that. According to everybody else, he was last in the family. He was the baby of the family. And then that day, the baby of the family wasn't spoiled so much. Well, that's not true. You know who you are, baby of the family. But the firstborn were the people that you were most proud of, the sons that you were most proud of. They received a double portion. They received more inheritance. They received the authority of the family. And yet God chose the runt, the youngest. That's not supposed to be on the world's perspective. See, God chooses people not because of what the world thinks should be done, because of what he thinks should be done. David wanted to do godly things. And that's why God chose him. He wanted to do godly things. David was a man after God's own heart. Honestly, the only thing I can think of that was different between Saul and David, that David really had a relationship with God. He had a relationship with God. Sure, he had a relationship with Samuel, but he had a relationship with God. That he sought the Lord. When there's times of struggles, he went to God. Because he had a lot of faults, that David. There was times that he lied for his own benefit. Do you know that Saul was so mad at David that David lived in exile among the Philistines? You know, the same Philistine where he killed the giant, right? And the Philistines let him stay amongst them. And what David would do was go and raid the outskirts of the Philistines and kill Philistines and come back in, and they would think that he was just out, raiding other lands. But no, he was actually raiding the Philistines, destroying the Philistines. He would come back in, and the kings would ask him, so where have you been at? He's like, oh yeah, I've been way out there, just plundering and lying to the king. And when there's a battle waged between Israel and the Philistines, and David told him, yeah, I'll fight with you against Israel. And then when the battle happened, he switched sides, went with Israel, and attacked the Philistines. A lot of lying going on, deceiving happening. That's the same David that committed adultery and murdered one of his good friends so he could have his wife. Same David that let his son go undisciplined, be unruly, and it cost him his kingdom for a short time. Yeah, that same David, God looked at and said, you're a man after my own heart. Not because of all of his imperfections, it's because he had a heart after God. And when he had faults and they were brought to him, he said, God, forgive me. I am wrong. Forgive me, God. He didn't go to the prophet and say, hey, go talk to God for me because I messed up. Father, forgive me, I have sinned. I take responsibility for my sin. And it's not perfection that God is looking for in leaders. It's not perfection. Because there is no such thing as the perfect leader. Whether you are a president of the United States or you're a pastor of a church, there is no perfect leader. And God looks at the heart. But David's relationship with God was personal, not perfect. It does not really matter who the king or our leader will be this next week. Above the fact that you need to make God your king. See, the question is how do I be at peace after this week? How do I come to the place that if chaos reigns and things just go crazy, how do I be at peace and are able to say, it is well with my soul? Because we do not trust in a president, we trust in the Lord. We trust in the Lord. See, Israel rejected God as their king. That was the real issue. That was the real issue. They rejected God as their king. He said this in 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 9. This is the story I had alluded to earlier. 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 9. You can turn there if you'd like. It says, Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the other nations. But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. See, Samuel was disappointed because as the prophet, as the judge at the moment, he felt they were rejecting him. Am I not leading the people in the ways of God good enough? And God was saying, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me as king. See, let us place God as king in our lives. And no matter what happens this week, we can trust that God will bring us peace. Because if your peace, personal peace, that well-being, that wholeness, rests in whether or not your candidate becomes president, you're going to have a hard time either way. Because really, we put God as king. And we trust that whatever happens, whether your guy gets in or not, whatever happens, we're going to trust in the Lord and we can be at peace. How does a person who lost their kids, how can they say it is well with my soul? Because their king is Jesus. Their king is the Lord. And no matter what happens in life, they can still be at peace. Because it's not the circumstances that bring peace. It's the King of righteousness, the Prince of Peace, that brings peace. So let's go back to our Philippians verse. Philippians 4 through 7. I'm going to read it again. If we place God as our King, what should our response be? Rejoice in the Lord always. Rejoice in the Lord only when elections go your way. No. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Let your gentle spirit, not your contentious spirit, not your angry spirit, not your frustrated, it didn't go your way spirit. Let your gentle spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. Be anxious for nothing. In other words, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving in your heart, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, or all comprehension, different version. 7, again. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. If we are seeking peace in these times of turmoil, we need to go to the God of peace. If we want peace in our hearts, our family, our country, we must seek the Prince of Peace, Jesus the Messiah. We must do what Paul encouraged the Philippians to do: rejoice in the Lord and pray. If we do this, no matter our lot, he will have taught us to say, "It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul." I read this psalm this last week in my devotion time. It was a psalm written by a man after God's own heart. And Psalm 29. And it really begins to show why David was a man after God's own heart. Even though he had failures and moral issues, he wanted to see God's work in his life and the life of his country. We see that in Psalm 29. Ascribe to the Lord, O sons of the mighty. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord glory due his name. Worship the Lord in holy array. The voice of the Lord is upon the waters, and the God of glory thunders, and the Lord is over many waters. And the voice of the Lord is powerful, and the voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks cedars. And yes, the Lord breaks into pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, and Sirion like the young wild ox. The voice of the Lord hews out flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord makes the deer to calve, and strips the forest bare. And in his temple everything says, glory. And the Lord sat as king over the flood. And yes, the Lord sits as king forever. And the Lord will give strength to his people, and the Lord will bless his people with peace. I want to read those last two verses, 10, starting at 10. And the Lord sat as king over the flood. And yes, the Lord sits as king forever. And the Lord will give strength to his people, and the Lord will bless his people with peace. The Lord is king over the flood. No matter what happens in the coming weeks, you can be at peace, not because of what rages around us or who is president, because your Lord is king in your life. And that feeling of dropping into, crossing those state lines for me as I'm dropping in back into Idaho, that feeling of, is the same feeling you can feel come Tuesday night and Wednesday morning. Because it doesn't matter, because the Lord is king over the flood. Amen?
Amen.